Welcome to today's webinar about shrink solutions from RGIS. My name is John Fitzgerald, Vice President of Marketing for RGIS, and I will be the moderator for today's live event. Our first speaker today is Dale Huggins, Vice President of Strategic Accounts at RGIS. RGIS has a long history of providing the inventory, insight, and services that grocery stores need to make better business decisions, but offering solutions to address the shrink identified in those inventories is a new area for the company. Joining Dale is Larry Miller, President of the Retail Control Group and a Director of the National Supermarket Research Group since 1991. After Larry presents, both Dale and Larry will be available for a Q&A session to answer the questions submitted by the audience. Take it away, Dale.
Thanks, John, and thank you to our attendees for joining our webinar on shrink solutions. While RGIS is known as an elite inventory service, we've always been dedicated to finding new ways to solve problems that will lead to increased sales and growth for the retailers we serve. A key concern that our customers report back as a business challenge is inventory shrinkage. Until just recently, RGIS's role related to shrinkage has been the scorekeeper. We provided inventory counts without any recommendations to improve results. RGIS is changing. We're going beyond the count, making the investment to move away from our scorekeeper role by providing access to industry professionals, tools, and practices that will help you manage your stores and help turn losses into sales. Today, we're very pleased to present the first in a series of webinars dedicated to delivering new ways and new tools to address and control shrinkage in your stores. We have partnered with Larry Miller and the Retail Control Group to help our grocery and convenience store customers with a bundled service offering for shrink identification, education, and control. Thank you again for your time today. Without any additional delay, please welcome Larry Miller, our featured presenter.
Thank you, Dale, and welcome everyone. I'm delighted to share some time with you today. We're going to be talking about the shrink diagnosis audit. And the shrink diagnosis audit is always a wonderful platform for discussion about how much better can we do when it comes to shrink reduction, because most companies tend to focus on, am I at budget? Am I beating last year? Am I doing a little bit better? Am I doing a lot better? But the shrink diagnosis audit from RGIS is really designed to say, here's where you are, and here's optimally where you can get to, not just to make your budget, but oftentimes to beat your budget. I've been studying shrink loss in supermarkets since 1991, and we've researched an awful lot of stores. In fact, this past year we researched 64 companies operating over 3,000 stores to identify the best ways to get shrink to its optimal lowest place. In fact, today we're going to be talking about shrink. We're going to be talking a lot about shrink and how to take a big bite out of shrink. So as we move forward, I'll be happy to take questions at the end of the webinar. I'm going to be presenting information about the National Supermarket Shrink Survey from 2013 and what we learned as a result of that survey. The agenda today will begin with where's your shrink? What the 64 companies, 3,000 stores said, here is where we are suffering shrink, and here is indeed what we're doing about it. Most of the shrink being centered in operational causes. We call that a fundamental breakdown in operational best practices rather than just theft prevention or theft identification. And then we're going to talk about the best practices to reduce operational shrink. We'll close with a 6-point action plan about exactly what the survey respondents and the data from the survey suggests retailers have to do to get optimal shrink reduction. And then we'll share a little bit of information about the actual shrink diagnosis audit throughout the entire process. So as we go forward today, we'll be talking about the National Supermarket Shrink Survey. Results have just been published for 2013. RGIS is the key gold sponsor of that survey. 64 companies, 3,075 stores. And as you go through the survey today, please look for the red star. The red star on each slide indicates one or more of the operational audit points that were surveyed during this survey. We actually questioned 347 unique operational audit points. Then we tabbed and cross-correlated those operational audit points to identify what's really working. And at the end of this webinar, you'll have an opportunity to download a free copy of the National Supermarket Shrink Survey for 2013 Executive Summary. A cautionary note about how to use this survey. Survey numbers are a cross-section of the industry. Large companies, small companies, companies that do a very good job of reducing shrink and controlling shrink, and companies that are searching for ways to do a better job. The big cautionary note is not to worry too much about the numbers, the specific numbers that you may or may not agree with, but more what are companies doing that are causing the results to go down. Because we're not looking just to make budget, we're offering opportunity to exceed budget, go beyond expectations. So when you use the survey, that's the way I would urge you to focus. This year's survey suggested and respondents reported that 64% of their store shrink was caused by a breakdown in operational best practices. 36% was caused by theft conditions, misdeeds, dishonesty, or fraud. And the average total store supermarket shrink was 2.70% of retail sales. That's retail shrink to retail sales. The average shrink per year that was lost was $512. 64% of that says that $326 per year per store is the available profit correction that we should be working on. As we look a little further, I'd just be curious and take a little survey. If you could answer this question as we go forward, we'll summarize the answers, and everybody can participate and know where the audience is seeing their shrink. So would you agree that operational shrink causes that level of shrink, and that's where we should be focusing rather than on theft-caused shrink? If you could click yes if you agree, no if you don't know if you're not sure, and we will submit those answers, and we'll tally those answers up and show you the results right now. 62% say yes, they agree. 37% say nope, they're not sure. Interestingly, nobody said no. I think theft is the cause. And I think we've discovered that over the years, putting in cameras, putting in EAS, putting in all the things to identify and or catch shrink, and still shrink is still a little higher than all of us would like it to be, because everyone on this call today is in search of lower shrink. And candidly, probably not just to make budget, although that's always a good thing, but to beat budget and get shrink down even further to give us the strategic advantage that added profit will give us. Survey respondents said that 65% of store shrink is in the perishable departments, and 35% is in the non-perishable or center store departments. When we break that down even further to the causes of operational shrink, here is where the RGIS shrink diagnosis audit really comes into play. You see the red star in the upper left-hand corner. The audit identifies and digs into your practices individually by company in ordering, receiving, production planning, storage and handling, rotation, cashier cost shrink. All those 9 parts of that pie chart are examined. You can see that shrink from ordering, meaning inefficient ordering, and all of its ramifications, is identified by survey respondents as causing 22%. That's the root cause of their shrink. 22% is caused by faulty or inefficient ordering. 17% is caused by production planning inefficiencies, 14% by storage and handling inefficiencies, and 14% by cashier-caused errors and mistakes. These are really key elements, and this one pie chart sets up a grand discussion on how to reduce operational shrink. In fact, when we look a little further at that, and we look at what the survey respondents said, basis the audit points from the survey, not following inventory control best practices was rated as the #1 cause. Well, the root cause of not following inventory control best practices is oftentimes centered in inefficient ordering. As we move forward and we say, what is the second biggest cause? It's poor management of the incoming gross margin. When survey respondents reported, it was inconclusive at best, that they had a sound system for saying the incoming gross margin mix based on breaking down all the cuts and all the merchandising. In the meat department, we know exactly what the incoming gross margin should be. Produce, same. Deli, same. Biggest diversion to that is in meat and produce, of course. Groceries a little bit more sound. They know what the incoming gross margin is because we modeled that in the industry very, very well. The third is inadequate training of store teams to see and identify and react to shrink-causing problems. Most often, they react to theft, dishonesty, problems, but not the operational causes of shrink, or what I really prefer to talk about as the profit optimization opportunities associated with inventory control, which was the number one cause of operational shrink. Fourth, integrating loss prevention into operations, meaning a really good working relationship of loss prevention and operations working to optimize profit, not just catch theft. Technology simplification, we all have technology throughout the stores. When we do the shrink audit, the RGIS shrink audit, we examine how well technology is being used, implemented, and understood in stores so that you're getting what I like to call technology ROI. Every single technology should be ROI'd every single year because there's a diminishing return on technology implementation effectiveness if it isn't consciously reinforced each year. Number 6, POS and receiving shrink. I think we all know about that, but the RGIS shrink audit digs into those best practices very keenly. And then we start to examine the C-suite focus and leadership when it comes to shrink reduction. What are their expectations? What are they looking for? What is the C-suite driving toward? We like to encourage during this audit practice that we should be working toward optimal shrink loss. Every store is going to have shrink loss. We're never going to eliminate it. We all know that. But what is your best case scenario beyond just making budget? So as we look a little further, I'd like to take you through a quick view of the vital role of inventory control. These 8 components, and you see the star in the upper left-hand corner, each one is uniquely examined in each individual company. We know that money starts in the bank, and buyers and merchandisers buy and price those goods for profit. That's the first area where there's an unknown, in most cases, cost of shrink. Unknown because every company is unique. Some companies have an excellent practice. Some companies have not so excellent practice for projecting the exact amount of incoming gross margin. The second area is how we order goods. And if you remember the pie chart, 22% of store shrink is manifested and root caused from inefficient ordering. At the back door in receiving best practices, 6% of shrink is lost. In storage and handling, up to 14% of shrink is lost. In production planning and mix, 17% of possible shrink is lost. In display space allocation, 7% of shrink. At the point of sale, through fraud and mistakes and errors and inefficiencies and price guessing, up to 9% of shrink. And all that occurs before profit is generated and we get back to the bank with the profit. Properly implemented, the best practices that come out of the shrink survey and that come out of the shrink loss diagnosis audit can yield from 10 to 18% reduction in store shrink versus last year prior to implementation of those best practices. So I'm curious to know if a 10 to 18% reduction in shrink versus last year would meet or exceed your budgeted shrink reduction plan for 2014 or your fiscal year as the case may be. So if it would, please check the first box. If 10 to 18% would exceed your plan, check the second box. If 10 to 18% is actually less than your plan, then please submit that. And the answer is that the audience brings in that 10 to 18% would exceed the plan. And that's what we want to do. That's the entire purpose of the shrink survey, the 2013 shrink survey, of all retailers in the supermarket-specific industry. And the shrink loss diagnosis audit is not just to have an incremental improvement, but to identify what your best case opportunity is for shrink loss. So I thank you very much for submitting that information, because it helps us to formulate at RGIS the very best plans possible to get you optimal results and move beyond the count. As we look at perishable shrink specifically, you can see from this chart that the overall shrink reported in meat was 4.10%, in produce 4.80%, and in deli 7.8%. Then tying back to the original pie chart and some of the other information that you've already seen, improper production planning and space allocation in the meat department was tagged at 32% of the cost, and inefficient ordering 28%. So you can see that all this information from all the various points of audit and control are all tying back to the same information. That's not intentional on our part or on the survey tabulator's part, but that's how we cross-check and cross-tab the information to find out what everybody's reporting. When you look at non-perishables and you look at the center column there, the department shrink, grocery came in at 1.10, HBA came in at 2.5, GM came in at 2.7, and so forth. So that one column answers the question, well, what are the national averages? Everybody always wants to ask us, what are the national averages? And the truth of the matter is national averages are interesting, they're fun, but they're irrelevant to your operation. They're just a benchmark. They're just a conversation piece. The shrink loss diagnosis audit is to identify, should you be, based on your format, your pricing, your demographics, should you be at 1.1 in grocery or 1.3 in grocery or 85 points in grocery? All those questions have to be answered uniquely by every single store. And the top best practices for shrink prevention in the perishable departments, very interestingly, again, inventory management, starting with a smart order, was number one on everyone's list that was reporting below average shrink in the perishable departments. When we cross-check those that are having best-in-class shrink to those that have what was reported as average to those that which were reported as high, the best-in-class company said inventory management, beginning with a smart order in the stores, is the number one prevention method for shrink loss prevention in perishables. Production planning came in second. How companies measure and report and analyze known loss jumped to the top of the top practices in perishables. Having stores measure their known loss in the store every single day and having the authority to investigate it, react to it, respond to it with operational best practices, oftentimes led by the store manager being trained in the business of profit-making in perishables. Workflow analysis and workflow standards came into impact, managing or providing for no masking of incoming gross margin, meaning no built-in shrink factor beyond what is approved. And number 7, physical inventory preparation and execution. Best-in-class companies said, we spend extra time in perishables doing preparation and execution for our monthly physical inventories. So as we look at that, the 6-point action plan has to come together, and it has to focus, number 1, on understanding where your shrink is, what your optimal shrink loss should be or could be with the implementation of best practices, installing the human best practices of how your store management team looks at profit making through shrink reduction. I urge that they not look at shrink reduction. They look at optimal profit making through shrink reduction. Big important message. And then making sure that all store teams understand known loss and they are empowered to reduce known loss without violating the merchandising and planograms, but they have to be empowered to be able to respond to that known loss or float the problem up to a higher authority that can help them solve the problem. How they audit the stores for operational effectiveness is very, very important. A lot of companies have internal audit departments, but they do not necessarily manage or audit or score operational best practices. That's another key element of best-in-class companies that are discovered and analyzed and revealed through the RGIS shrink loss audit. And then there's a relentlessness. There's just an attitude that companies have. They're not tactically driving shrink reduction down as a after-the-fact practice. They're actually relentlessly out in front of shrink, implementing best operating practices to mitigate shrink before it ever happens. As we look at that, these are the kinds of conditions physically that you're looking at right now. When we got in the shrink survey and when we do the shrink loss diagnosis audit, we look for neat, clean conditions that indicate that they are receiving right, ordering right, storage and handling right in a neat, clean environment. This is a great example of what every company that is the best-in-class company that the shrink loss diagnosis audit reveals. These are the kind of conditions that lead to optimal profit and optimal shrink control. Analyzing and monitoring known loss is done by many companies. And every time an audit is conducted, people say, oh, yeah, we monitor known loss. We write down our known loss, or we scan out our known loss. The urging of this one category is very key to everyone's understanding that writing down known loss, monitoring known loss is not the key. What we do with what we learn from writing down known loss is more important than writing down known loss. A lot of companies have errant or failed or inefficient practices of scanning out the known loss and then doing something specific and concrete. And that's why the audit challenges not are you writing down known loss, but what are you doing with that information and what are your optimal known loss numbers? Where should you be able to get with optimal best practices? Back rooms that are neat and clean. This is not staged. We just contacted a lot of the companies that reported best-in-class shrink levels and went out and asked them to take us pictures of their back rooms on a given day without notice. These stores operate a neat, clean, organized back room and cooler area. The other conditions like this one, look at the receiving area. You can see on the left side of the screen how the receiving area clipboards and notices and desk are in a secured spot, and all the clipboards are organized in a very disciplined manner. Again, conditions associated with best-in-class shrink results that the shrink loss diagnosis audit digs into. Not just go to take pictures, but actually look at every clipboard, see what the best practices are, station someone back by receiving for 3 days to analyze exactly what practices are happening in the stores. Very key issues. And then when the manager counsels and coaches department heads and how they coach and counsel and what they coach and counsel on. The shrink survey, coupled with the RGIS shrink loss diagnosis audit, shows that there are 10 key KPIs, key performance indicators, that if store managers are taught to understand and use in harmony and in sync with their department heads and their cashiers, we can make major impact into reducing shrink through the human resources we have in the stores. So that just brings us up to the next question. Would a comprehensive shrink audit reduction analysis or plan of action help you to reduce your shrink? Do you think that would be beneficial? Now, nobody's going to call you. Nobody's going to come after you. It's just whether or not you think it would be helpful to you. Please check yes in the first box if you think it would absolutely help. Probably is second. And if you're just not sure, or you just don't think, you think you're doing everything you need to do and everything's where you want it to be, then probably not at this time would be the question. And as you submit that, the answers that come back is, that's very interesting. In fact, I've never seen that. Exactly what you all are looking at right now, that exactly 50% said, yes, absolutely, a shrink loss diagnosis audit would be of service to us and help us to get to not our budget, but our optimal shrink. And then 50%, exactly another 50% said, probably it would help us. So these are all great, and this just helps us at RGIS to make sure that we're providing the services not to just count your inventory, but to help you get the best-in-class shrink results. So I appreciate your time spent. I really hope it's been valuable and helpful to you. Dale?
Okay, thank you very much, Larry. And thank you to everybody that's participated for the time that you've invested, as well as your interest in Shrink Solutions webinar. RGIS Shrink Solutions can be arranged as a standalone service or bundled with your inventory program for maximum effectiveness. If you're interested in learning more about how RGIS Shrink Solutions can help your organization, I would encourage you to contact me, Dale Huggins, here at RGIS, or Larry Miller via the email addresses we're providing on the next screen. We're here to help, and we want you to use the service. John Fitzgerald is going to rejoin the conversation to lead our question and answer session. John?
Great. Well, that's a very compelling business case for addressing operational shrink, Larry. Thank you very much. I'm going to take a moment and address our first question. Looks like we've got one from a large national grocery chain. I think this is probably for you, Larry. When you do the shrink audit, how long does it take?
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. Depends on the size of the company and the dispersion of the stores in a given marketplace. That's number one. So drive time is affected, and the physical size of the store takes longer to do a much larger formatted store. Typically, we send a 3 to 4 man audit team in for 3 to 4 days. So the 3 to 4 man audit team is on site in the stores, asking questions, interviewing people, watching practices for 3 to 4 days. That also leads us, we call it breadcrumbs. If the breadcrumbs lead us to have to interview and talk to the CFO about financial practices, just so we get a complete and comprehensive understanding, we'll go outside of the store to ask questions. But we interview store managers, district managers, merchandisers, everybody about the entire store operation. We do a wall-to-wall audit in 3 to 4 days with 3 to 4 store operations experienced executives.
We've got a second question here from, looks like a regional convenience store chain. How do we get the results of the audit?
You guys are digging down well. The audit takes 2 weeks to compile and compress. The 4 people get together and they collaborate so that they're not just using isolated observations, but the person doing receiving and front end might say, I watched this, I saw this, and the guy that did perishables may say, well, did you check this? What did you find in that? So there's a big collaboration that goes on. Then the report is written. It takes about 2 weeks to compile all of that, seldom less than 2 weeks, might take 3. It tends to come out then in a 60 to 70 page written report that we hand deliver to the executive team 2 to 3 weeks after the audit with a PowerPoint presentation where the high level and detailed granular findings are. So it's delivered both in written form and PowerPoint to the executive team.
Great. Next question is, how would you handle, or maybe the question is, does your program handle vendor fraud issues?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely it does. We look at the entire receiving practice. One of our auditors, who is a former vice president of internal audit and loss prevention for a large supermarket regional chain, actually stations himself back by receiving and looks at every practice for 3 solid days in multiple stores. So he goes from one store to the next store to the next store and then doubles back again. So he sees early morning receiving and the other. Then he will take apart a package of invoices to see if any invoices look like they are suspect of being charged properly, counted properly. So yeah, we'll take apart the entire practice of best practices for backdoor receiving as well as invoice auditing.
We've got another question, looks like from a national groceries chain. It says 10% lower shrink is very attractive. Is that just in grocery, or do you do perishables too?
Actually, the biggest, again, it's a really good question. The biggest shrink reduction gains that companies make are in perishables. 65%, as one of the pie charts that I showed indicate, 65% of store shrink occurs in the perishable department. So typically, the audit will reveal opportunities to reduce perishable shrink between 15 and 20%. Grocery and HBC and frozen food, somewhat less, maybe 8 to 10%. But the flush out of all departments, because it is a wall-to-wall comprehensive audit, very heavily focused on perishables, We always talk about 10 to 18%, but that's the historical average. We have never seen a company not achieve the 10%. So I like to under-promise and over-perform.
Great. Dale, I think this question might be best addressed by you. The question is, how would you integrate shrink management with current services? And by current services, I'm assuming they mean physical inventory services.
So that's a really good question. The way that we would work that is we would bundle in the shrink audit as a first step into the physical inventory process. And after we give you back results from the shrink audit, then we would show you ways that interim inventories and ongoing service costs can be handled with the shrink audit built right in and the shrink educational program included. So it's bundling the services up so that you get a continual view of what's going on and some checkpoints along the way.
Larry, I think this one is for you. What is the length of the RGIS program, and do you work with us to train our staff in those best practices for eliminating shrink?
Let me answer the second half first. And the answer is, based on the audit, based on the company's interest and needs for training for their managers, the answer is yes. There's a comprehensive curriculum-based training program that centers on total store management for shrink prevention and profit optimization. And when I say curriculum-based, it's not a one-off. But the fact is, as we train companies, one-off trainings come in, rah, 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 make everybody feel good, has a limited scope effect and impact. So we've developed a complete and comprehensive total store manager program for curriculum-based training to help change the operating culture to one of operating best practices.
Well, looks like we've answered all the questions from our audience. I'd like to thank Dale and Larry for their time today, and thank you, our audience, for the time that you invested in today's webinar. If you do have any additional questions, please feel free to contact our speakers directly using the contact information on the screen in front of you. As Dale mentioned, the shrink auditing and educational service solutions that we discussed today can be arranged as a standalone service, or it can be bundled with your inventory program to maximize effectiveness. From all of us at RGIS and the Retail Control Group, thank you for attending and have a great rest of your day.